Steve Rogers stood alone in the abandoned HYDIA facility, his shield catching the pale moonlight that filtered through shattered windows. The air was thick with dust and the metallic scent of old machinery. His footsteps echoed in the hollow corridors as he moved deeper into the complex, following intelligence that had led him here to this forgotten outpost in the mountains of Eastern Europe. The mission was supposed to be routine. Intel suggested HYDIA operatives were using this facility to store sensitive data about super soldier experiments. What Steve found instead would change everything he thought he knew about his past and his future. In the deepest level of the facility, behind reinforced steel doors that his shield had barely managed to breach, Steve discovered a laboratory that looked eerily familiar. The equipment was decades old but maintained with meticulous care. Charts and diagrams covered the walls, all bearing his name, his measurements, his blood type. This wasn't just any HYDIA facility. This was a shrine to the Winter Soldier program, and more specifically, to him. As he examined the research materials more closely, Steve's heart began to race. The documents revealed something impossible, something that made his stomach drop with a sickening realization. The super soldier serum that had transformed him from a frail young man into Captain America wasn't just enhancing his body, it was slowly killing him. The serum, designed to push human capabilities beyond natural limits, created a constant state of cellular acceleration. For decades, Steve had assumed his enhanced healing factor and increased longevity were permanent gifts. The truth was far more sinister. His cells were burning through their natural lifespan at an exponential rate, masked by the serum's ability to rapidly regenerate damaged tissue. But like a candle burning twice as bright, it would burn half as long. According to the research, Steve had perhaps 6 months before his enhanced physiology would begin to fail catastrophically. The serum that made him a hero would become his executioner, causing his body to age decades in a matter of weeks. The process would be irreversible once it began, and there was no known cure. Steve sank into a nearby chair, the weight of his revelation crushing down on him like a physical force. He thought about all the battles he had fought, all the lives he had saved, and all the sacrifices he had made in the name of freedom and justice. Had it all been borrowed time? Had every heroic act been one step closer to his own destruction? The documents contained detailed projections about what would happen when the serum began to fail. His strength would fade first, followed by his enhanced reflexes and healing abilities. Eventually, his body would begin to shut down as decades of suppressed aging caught up with him all at once. The process would be painful, undignified, and inevitable. As Steve sat there in the cold, empty laboratory, surrounded by the clinical evidence of his approaching mortality, he felt a profound sense of isolation. How could he tell his friends and teammates that their invincible Captain America was living on borrowed time? How could he continue to lead them into battle, knowing that he might collapse at any moment? He gathered the documents carefully, knowing that he needed to verify their accuracy, but deep in his heart, he already knew they were telling the truth. Too many things suddenly made sense. The occasional moments of unusual fatigue he had dismissed, the subtle changes in his recovery time that he had attributed to stress, the way his body sometimes felt like it was fighting against itself. Outside the facility, Steve looked up at the star-filled sky and felt the weight of time pressing down on him. He had always known that being Captain America meant making sacrifices, but he had never imagined that the ultimate sacrifice would be his very existence. The shield felt heavier in his hands as he realized that every mission from this point forward could be his last. The walk back to his motorcycle felt like the longest journey of his life. Each step carried him further from the innocent belief that he would always be there to protect the people he loved, and closer to a future where he would have to find a way to say goodbye to everything that mattered to him. The hardest part wasn't accepting his own mortality, it was figuring out how to tell the world that Captain America was dying. As he started the engine and began the long ride home, Steve made a decision that would define his final months. He would not waste time feeling sorry for himself or raging against fate. Instead, he would use whatever time he had left to ensure that his legacy would outlive his failing body, and that the ideals he had fought for would continue long after the super soldier serum claimed its final victory. The discovery in that abandoned facility marked the end of one chapter in Steve Rogers' life, but it also marked the beginning of the most important mission he had ever undertaken, learning how to let go. Steve Rogers had never been good at keeping secrets, especially from the people he cared about most. For 3 weeks after the discovery of the HYDIA facility, he carried the burden of his diagnosis like a stone in his chest. Every conversation with his fellow Avengers felt like a lie by omission. Every mission briefing was shadowed by the knowledge that he might not live to see its completion. The confirmation had come from Dr. Helen Cho, whose advanced regenerative technology had revealed the cellular damage that the HY scientists had predicted. The look in her eyes when she delivered the results told Steve everything he needed to know before she even spoke. His worst fears were now medical fact. Sitting in his apartment in Brooklyn, Steve stared at the medical report spread across his kitchen table. The technical language couldn't disguise the simple truth. His enhanced metabolism was consuming his life force at an accelerated rate. The very qualities that made him Captain America were now counting down the days until his body would betray him completely. The first person he told was Sam Wilson. They were sitting on a park bench near the reflecting pool where they had first met, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and amber. Steve had chosen this place deliberately. It represented new beginnings, hope, and the friendship that had helped him adjust to a world that had moved on without him. "Sam," Steve began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise me you'll let me finish before you say anything." Sam turned to look at him, immediately recognizing gravity in his friend's tone. He nodded silently, giving Steve the space he needed to find his words. "The super soldier serum is killing me," Steve said simply. "I have maybe 4 months left before my body starts shutting down. Maybe less." The silence that followed was deafening. Sam's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and then a deep sadness that made Steve's chest tighten with guilt. Finally, Sam spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you known?" 3 weeks, Steve admitted. "I needed to be sure before I told anyone. I needed to understand what we're dealing with." Sam stood up abruptly, pacing a few steps away before turning back to face Steve. 3 weeks? "Steve, we're supposed to be partners. We're supposed to face things together. How could you carry this alone?" "Because I knew you'd react exactly like this," Steve replied, standing to meet his friend's eyes. "I knew you'd want to drop everything and find a way to fix it. But Sam, there's no fix. This isn't a problem we can solve by fighting harder or being cleverer. This is biology, and it's already won." The conversation with Sam was just a beginning. Over the next few days, Steve found himself having variations of the same difficult discussion with each member of his inner circle. Natasha received the news with her characteristic stoicism, but he saw the pain flash across her face before she masked it with professional detachment. Tony's reaction was pure stock, immediate denial followed by manic determination to find a technological solution that didn't exist. "There has to be something," Tony insisted, pacing around his workshop like a caged animal. "We have alien technology, magic, time travel capabilities. We've literally brought people back from the dead. You're telling me we can't figure out how to fix some cellular degradation?" "Tony, I've seen the projections," Steve said patiently. "Every attempt to counteract the serum's effects would only accelerate the process. My body is too dependent on the enhanced metabolism now. Trying to reverse it would be like trying to stop a freight train with a paper wall." But perhaps the hardest conversation was the one he had with Bucky Barnes. They met at the Smithsonian, standing in front of the Captain America exhibit that had once seemed like a monument to their shared past. Now it felt like a premature memorial. "Remember when we were kids, and you used to say you'd follow me anywhere?" Steve asked, his voice thick with unshed tears. Bucky nodded, his metal arm catching the museum's artificial lighting. "I meant it then, and I mean it now." "I know you did," Steve replied. "But this is one place you can't follow me, Buck. And for the first time in my life, I need you to let me go ahead alone." The weight of telling his closest friends and teammates was almost unbearable, but Steve knew it was necessary. They deserved to know the truth, and he deserved the chance to say goodbye properly. He had learned long ago that some battles couldn't be won, but they could still be fought with honor and dignity. As news of his condition spread through the superhero community, Steve found himself becoming the recipient of an outpouring of support and love that both humbled and strengthened him. Heroes who had once been rivals put aside their differences to offer whatever help they could provide. Scientists, doctors, and mystics all volunteered their expertise, even though Steve had already accepted that their efforts would be futile. The hardest part wasn't facing his own mortality. It was watching the people he loved struggle to accept what he had already come to terms with. Their pain was his pain, multiplied by the knowledge that his condition was causing them to suffer alongside him. But in their grief, Steve also found something unexpected, clarity about what truly mattered in the time he had left. The weight of truth, once shared, became lighter to bear. He was no longer carrying the burden alone, and that made all the difference in how he would spend his remaining days. The secret was out, and now the real work could begin. With his diagnosis now known to his closest allies, Steve Rogers faced a new kind of battle, one against time itself. He had roughly 3 months left before his body would begin its final decline, and he was determined to make every day count. The team had initially tried to convince him to step back from active duty, to spend his remaining time resting and preparing for the inevitable. Steve had refused with the quiet authority that had made him a leader for so many years. "I'm not going to spend my last month sitting in a rocking chair, waiting to die," he told the assembled Avengers during what would be his final mission briefing as their active leader. "I'm going to do what I've always done, fight for the people who can't fight for themselves." The mission that would become his last official operation as Captain America came from an unexpected source. Intelligence agencies had discovered a human trafficking ring operating across 3 continents, using advanced technology to move victims undetected through international borders. The operation was massive, well-funded, and protected by corrupt officials at the highest levels of government. It was exactly the kind of mission that had always driven Steve Rogers, protecting the innocent from those who would exploit their vulnerability. The fact that his body was slowly betraying him didn't change his sense of duty or his determination to see justice done. Working alongside Natasha, Sam, and Bucky, Steve threw himself into the mission with an intensity that surprised even his longtime partners. His tactical mind was as sharp as ever, his strategic thinking unclouded by the knowledge of his approaching mortality. If anything, the urgency of his situation seemed to focus his abilities rather than diminish them. The operation took them from the slums of Mumbai to the underground tunnels of Prague, from corporate boardrooms in Geneva to shipping docks in Rotterdam. At each location, they dismantled another piece of the trafficking network, liberating dozens of victims and gathering evidence that would eventually bring down the entire organization. But it was during the final phase of the mission, in a warehouse complex outside Berlin, that Steve truly understood what it meant to fight with nothing left to lose. The traffickers had taken a group of children hostage, threatening to execute them if the authorities didn't back down. The situation required someone to infiltrate the compound alone, someone who could get close enough to neutralize the threat before innocent lives were lost. Steve volunteered immediately, ignoring the protests of his teammates. His logic was unassailable. He was the one member of the team whose life was already forfeit. If the mission went wrong, if he didn't make it out alive, it would simply mean that the serum had claimed him a few weeks earlier than expected. Moving through the warehouse with a fluid grace that had made him a legend, Steve felt a strange sense of peace. This was what he had been born to do, what he had been transformed to accomplish. Every skill he had learned, every battle he had fought, had led him to this moment, alone in the darkness, standing between evil and innocence. The confrontation with the traffickers was swift and decisive. Steve's enhanced reflexes and decades of combat experience allowed him to disable the hostage-takers without a single child being harmed. As he led the rescued victims to safety, he felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal glory and everything to do with knowing he had made a difference. But the mission took its toll. For the first time since his transformation, Steve felt the weight of physical exhaustion that couldn't be cured by a good night's sleep. His hand shook slightly as he removed his uniform, and he noticed that his healing factors seemed to be working more slowly than usual. The cellular degradation that Dr. Cho had warned him about was beginning to manifest in subtle but unmistakable ways. In the weeks that followed the Berlin operation, Steve took on several smaller missions, stopping a bank robbery in Chicago, helping evacuate civilians during a chemical plant explosion in Detroit, providing security for a peace summit in Washington. Each mission was successful, but each one also reminded him that his time was running short. The most difficult part of these final missions wasn't the physical challenges or the tactical complexities. It was the knowledge that he was saying goodbye to a way of life that had defined him for decades. Every time he picked up his shield, every time he put on the uniform, every time he stood up to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves, he was creating memories that would have to last forever. His teammates began to notice the changes too. His reflexes were still faster than any normal humans, but they weren't quite as lightning quick as they had been. His strength was still superhuman, but there were moments when he seemed to struggle with weights that would have been effortless just months earlier. Most telling of all, his recovery time after missions was getting longer, and the fatigue in his eyes was becoming harder to hide. During what turned out to be his final mission, stopping a group of domestic terrorists from bombing a children's hospital in Philadelphia, Steve realized that he could no longer ignore the truth his body was telling him. As he walked away from the hospital, surrounded by grateful families and cheering crowds, he felt the weight of finality settling over him like a heavy cloak. The mission had been a complete success. The terrorists were in custody, no civilians had been injured, and another group of innocent people had been saved. But as Steve looked back at the hospital, watching children wave at him from their windows, he knew that this was how he wanted his active career as Captain America to end, not with some grand, dramatic sacrifice, but with a simple act of protecting those who needed protection most. His final missions had reminded him of why he had become Captain America in the first place, and they had given him the peace of mind he needed to face what came next. The decision of who would inherit the mantle of Captain America had kept Steve awake for countless nights over the past month. His body was beginning to show more obvious signs of the cellular breakdown that Dr. Cho had predicted. His hair was beginning to gray, fine lines were appearing around his eyes, and his legendary stamina was noticeably diminished. Time was running short, and the weight of choosing his successor felt heavier than any burden he had carried as a hero. The obvious choice was Sam Wilson. Sam had proven himself time and again, not just as a Falcon, but as a leader, a strategist, and most importantly, as someone who understood that being Captain America wasn't about the shield or the super soldier serum. It was about the willingness to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. But the conversation Steve needed to have with Sam was more complex than simply handing over a piece of vibranium and walking away. He needed Sam to understand the full weight of what he would be inheriting, and he needed to be sure that Sam was ready to carry that burden. They met at the Lincoln Memorial on a cold Tuesday morning in November. The monument's marble steps were nearly empty, creating a sense of solitude that Steve needed for this most important of conversations. He had chosen this location deliberately. Lincoln had faced impossible decisions during the darkest period in American history, and had found the strength to do what was necessary for the greater good. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," Sam began, settling onto the steps beside Steve, "about how being Captain America isn't really about the person wearing the costume." Steve nodded, his breath visible in the chilly air. "It's about the idea that the costume represents. The belief that there are things worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, even when the odds seem impossible. And you think I can carry that burden?" Sam asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I think you've already been carrying it," Steve replied. "Every time you stood beside me in battle, every time you put yourself at risk to protect others, every time you've chosen to do what's right instead of what's easy, you've been Captain America in every way that matters." The formal ceremony took place 3 days later in a secure facility that had been chosen for both its symbolic significance and its security. Representatives from every major superhero team were in attendance, along with key figures from the intelligence community and select government officials who had earned Steve's trust over the years. But before the public ceremony, Steve wanted a private moment with his closest friends and allies. In a small conference room adjacent to the main hall, he gathered the people who had meant the most to him during his time as Captain America. "I want you all to know that this isn't goodbye," he told them, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "This is me trusting you to carry on the work we've been doing together. Sam will be Captain America, but all of you will be his support system, just like you've been mine." Tony Stark, uncharacteristically subdued, stepped forward first. "For what it's worth, Cap, you've set an impossible standard for anyone to follow. But if anyone can do it, it's Sam." Natasha was next, her usual stoicism cracking slightly as she embraced Steve. "You taught me that redemption was possible," she whispered. "That's a gift I can never repay." Bucky's goodbye was the most difficult. The two men who had grown up together in Brooklyn, who had survived war and transformation and loss, stood facing each other knowing that their shared journey was coming to an end. "I wish I could have saved you from this," Bucky said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did save me," Steve replied. "You saved me from becoming someone I wouldn't recognize. You reminded me who Steve Rogers was before he became Captain America, and that's the most important gift anyone could give." The formal ceremony was brief but powerful. As Steve handed the shield to Sam, he felt a profound sense of completion. The vibranium disc that had been his companion through countless battles would now serve a new generation of heroism. This shield belongs to everyone who believes in the ideals it represents, Steve said, addressing not just Sam but everyone in attendance. Sam Wilson will carry it with honor, as I tried to do, and as someone else will do after him. The shield is eternal. The man who carries it is just its temporary guardian. Sam accepted the shield with the solemnity the moment deserved. As he held it for the first time as a new Captain America, Steve saw in his friend's eyes the same mixture of determination and humility that he hoped had defined his own tenure as the Star-Spangled Man. Later that evening, as the official celebrations wound down, Steve found himself alone with Sam on the facility's observation deck. The city lights stretched out below them, a reminder of all the people they had sworn to protect. "Are you ready for this?" Steve asked, though he already knew the answer. "No," Sam replied honestly, "but I don't think anyone ever is. The question isn't whether I'm ready, it's whether I'm willing to try to be worthy of what you've built." "You already are," Steve said simply. "The shield doesn't make you Captain America, Sam. You make the shield Captain America." As they stood there in comfortable silence, Steve felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The decision had been made. The transition was complete, and America's shield would continue to protect the innocent long after Steve Rogers was gone. In passing the shield to Sam Wilson, Steve had ensured that his legacy would live on in the hands of someone who understood that being Captain America wasn't about personal glory. It was about service to something greater than yourself. The mantle had been passed, and Steve Rogers could face his final chapter with the peace of knowing that Captain America would endure. The cellular degradation had accelerated over the past 2 weeks, just as Dr. Cho's projections had predicted. Steve Rogers could feel his body betraying him in small but undeniable ways. His vision occasionally blurred. His hands sometimes trembled when he thought no one was looking, and the fatigue that had once been manageable was now a constant companion. The super soldier serum that had given him decades of enhanced life was finally demanding its payment in full. He had perhaps 2 weeks left before the decline would become too obvious to hide, too dramatic to explain away as simple exhaustion. The time had come for the most difficult mission of his life, learning how to say goodbye without actually saying the words. Steve had decided that he would not burden his friends with a prolonged death watch. He had seen too many good people fade away slowly, their loved ones helpless to do anything but watch the inevitable unfold day by painful day. He would spare his team the anguish by simply disappearing when the time came, leaving behind only the memories of who he had been at his strongest rather than who he was becoming in his weakness. The plan he had formulated was elegant in its simplicity. He would spend the next week visiting each of his closest friends and allies, ostensibly for routine meetings or casual conversations. During these visits, he would create final memories, share unspoken feelings, and provide the closure that none of them would realize they were receiving until it was too late to stop him. His first stop was Stark Tower, where he found Tony in his workshop, surrounded by the controlled chaos of genius at work. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, past missions, future technologies, and the peculiar friendship that had developed between two men who approached heroism from completely different angles. "You know, Cap," Tony said as they stood overlooking the city from the tower's balcony, "I never thanked you for showing me what real leadership looks like. I spent years thinking that being the smartest guy in the room was enough. You taught me that being right isn't nearly as important as being willing to make the hard choices for the right reasons." Steve felt his throat tighten with emotion, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "You taught me something, too. Tony, you showed me that sacrifice doesn't always have to be noble or pure. Sometimes the greatest act of heroism is just being willing to try, even when you're not sure you're doing it right." The conversation with Natasha took place on a park bench where they had once sat after a particularly difficult mission. She had always been able to read him better than anyone else, and Steve could see her watching him with a sharp awareness that had made her such an effective spy. "You're planning something," she said without preamble. "I can see it in your eyes." Steve smiled sadly. "I'm always planning something. That's what strategists do." "Not like this," she replied. "This feels like goodbye." For a moment, Steve considered telling her the truth. Natasha deserved honesty, and she was strong enough to handle whatever he told her. But he also knew that her loyalty would compel her to try to stop him, and he couldn't allow that to happen. "We all have to say goodbye eventually," he said instead. The question is whether we make it count." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Just remember that some of us are going to miss you more than you realize." The visit with Bucky was the most painful. They walked through the streets of Brooklyn where they had grown up, passing landmarks that held decades of shared memories. Their conversation meandered through stories of their childhood, their service in the war, and the strange journey that had brought them both into the 21st century. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd never left Brooklyn?" Bucky asked as they stopped in front of the apartment building where they had once lived. "Every day," Steve admitted. "But then I remember all the people we've been able to help, all the lives we've saved, and I know we made the right choice, even if it cost us everything else." "It didn't cost us everything," Bucky replied quietly. "We still have each other." Steve had to look away to hide the tears that threatened to fall. "Yeah, Buck, we'll always have each other." The final goodbye was with Sam, who had officially taken over as Captain America, but still sought Steve's counsel on complex decisions. They met at the reflecting pool where their friendship had begun, and Steve found himself remembering the morning when he had first told Sam about his diagnosis. "I want you to know that I'm proud of the job you're doing," Steve said as they watched the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. "You've made the shield your own, and that's exactly what it needed." "I'm still figuring it out," Sam replied. "Some days I feel like I'm just pretending to be you." "Good," Steve said firmly. "The day you stop being Sam Wilson and start trying to be Steve Rogers is the day you'll fail as Captain America. The shield chose you because of who you are, not because of who you think you should be." As the week progressed, Steve felt a deep sense of peace settling over him. He had said everything that needed to be said, shared every important memory, and provided whatever wisdom he could to the people who would carry on without him. His affairs were in order, his legacy was secure, and his conscience was clear. On his final morning, Steve Rogers woke before dawn in the small cabin he had purchased months earlier in the mountains of upstate New York. The location was remote enough that no one would find him until long after the cellular collapse had run its course, but beautiful enough that his last moments would be spent surrounded by the natural beauty that had always given him peace. He sat on the cabin's front porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains, and thought about all the sunrises he had been privileged to witness. Each one had been a gift, a reminder that every day brought new possibilities for heroism, for love, for hope. As the morning light grew stronger, Steve felt his body beginning to fail in earnest. The process was surprisingly peaceful, less like dying than like simply fading away, as if he were becoming transparent to the world around him. His last thought was not of regret or fear, but of gratitude. He had been given the extraordinary opportunity to make a difference, to stand for something greater than himself, to leave the world a little better than he had found it. Not everyone was blessed with such a clear sense of purpose, and he was thankful for every moment he had been allowed to save. Steve Rogers closed his eyes as the sun reached its zenith, and Captain America passed quietly from the world, his final mission complete. He had lived as he had chosen to die, with dignity, honor, and an unwavering commitment to the ideals that had defined his remarkable life. The shield would endure, pass from one worthy guardian to the next, but Steve Rogers had found his rest at last.